Welcome back to Face the Nation. I'm John Dickerson. Joining us now for some analysis, Lanhee Chen, who was policy director for the Romney campaign and is now a fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. CBS News contributor Frank Luntz. Susan Page is the Washington bureau chief at USA Today. Jeffrey Goldberg is editor-in-chief at The Atlantic. Frank, I want to start with you. What we've seen over the last 2 days, is that the tableau of America, the cheers for Trump and then the marches against him? Is that where we are in politics?
There are three attributes that matter more than anything else in American life: respect, civility, and tolerance. And we're not seeing much of that from anyone right now. When Donald Trump delivered his speech, he had some very powerful lines and talked about the people getting their government back, and that's to be applauded. But there was no respect for the previous president or any of the presidents. There was no respect for people who were up there on the podium. And the next day, I got attacked the next day, not even at the rally, by someone who called me a fascist, and I won't use the language because I don't want to get fired. But we now believe that we can say and do anything to anyone at any time. We have lost that sense of decency, and frankly, I don't know how we're going to get it back.
I want to talk about the speech in a minute, but Susan, what was the purpose of the march yesterday? Was it just we don't like Donald Trump? Was there more to it?
You know, I think something we use the word unprecedented too much to talk about Donald Trump, but I do think something extraordinary has happened. And on Friday, we saw a new grassroots movement take over the White House and the Republican Party. And on Saturday, we saw an entirely separate grassroots movement rise up against that. And these are millions of Americans on each side who don't just disagree on policy. They think the other side is fundamentally attacking what makes their country great. They have clashing visions of what the nation ought to be. And this is going to, I think, play out in a big way over the next 4 years.
Jeffrey, what Susan talks about is a populist movement on both sides that we've seen all across the world. Le Pen in France, in Great Britain with Brexit. Do you see a big, is this now global?
It certainly is global. I mean, you have populists rising across Europe. I think you're also going to see a concerted effort by Trump people to help those people rise, and so you're going to have an echoing effect, and this obviously goes into the Trump affection, let's call it, for Vladimir Putin. This idea of a strong man who will solve your problems. He is attracted to people in the populist movement across the world who affect that kind of posture toward democracy and toward the idea of I alone can fix your problems. That's where we're heading.
Lanhee, I want to talk a little bit about the speech and the vision that Donald Trump laid out. One portion of people, the Trump supporters, say he was in this speech, which some people have called dark, telling it like it is, diagnosing America with clear eyes. And then the other half has a view that when you are that dark, you make bad policy as a result because you get everybody too scared. What's your view of the political dynamic right now?
The lens through which you see Donald Trump is the lens through which you saw that speech. And I think it is the case that there are some who believe that the country is in a very dark place. And I think those are the people primarily who went out and supported Donald Trump. The policy part of this is very interesting, though, because on the one hand, in the speech, you have things that a Democrat could have argued for: bigger infrastructure spending, anti-free trade. But then the actual policy the administration has engaged in so far has been deeply conservative. It's been an executive order to freeze regulation and an executive order to reinforce that Obamacare repeal is the policy of the administration, but more than that, policy that may gut the Affordable Care Act at an executive level. So it's really interesting how we're being buffeted from one side to the other by the speech and then by the action of the administration.
But you know, it's interesting, two words he didn't use in that speech: Republican and Democratic. And there was some of the policies he outlined that could not have been much comfort to the members, the Republican members of Congress sitting behind him. And in fact, he indicted really the political establishment of both parties.
The interesting thing about this, obviously Democrats were made uncomfortable by many aspects of that speech, but the Republican members of Congress sitting up there, those who are ideological Republicans, when you start promising bridges and tunnels and highways and airports and don't seem to care or articulate at least how you're going to pay for that, that had a lot of people, I think, very upset and worried as well.
And no one knows what to expect. The fact is, there isn't a Republican member of Congress who knows exactly what Donald Trump is going to do on health care, what he's going to do on the budget, what he's going to do on taxes.
But you're assuming that Donald Trump knows.
But there's, or the administration, but we've never had a situation, and we don't even know how the public is going to react to any of this.
Right.
I've never seen a situation, I've been doing this for 25 years, where there's more doubt and more people are wrong on more things. It's dangerous to do a show like this because within 24 hours, each one of us will be proven wrong on something.
Well,
That's never stopped us before.
yeah, really.
Let me ask, Lanhee, say what you were going to say, but let me add this to it, which is, was that a conservative speech? Was that a Republican speech? Give us a label that helps us understand it, if you can.
I don't think we can label it. I think that's part of what people are having difficulty with, is that, you know, it used to be the case that you could expect a Republican president to get up there and give a certain kind of speech. That was not the
I think we
speech you
can
would
label
expect.
it. We can label it a dystopian, the first dystopian inaugural in history, a dark vision of America that very few presidents, very few politicians ever.
But this is how
articulate.
people feel. We've never had as many
Right.
people who believe the country is heading in the wrong direction. We've never had as many people who don't trust the media, don't trust the politicians, don't trust economics, don't trust business. There's a reason why 2/3 of young people now believe that socialism is a better solution for American economics than capitalism. It's because they've lost
But
faith.
John, to return to your point, I think it will be interesting to see the first fault line between the Republican majority in the Congress and the president. Is it going to be over the Affordable Care Act? Is it going to be over infrastructure? Is it going to be over tax reform? Because right now it seems the posture that many Republican members of Congress are taking is we're going to wait and see, but we're going to be supportive.
I think it might be over
Moderately
Russia.
paced. Or it could be over Russia this week. Absolutely.
Right. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Because that's
We've
certainly
gotten some
what Lindsey
indication on
Graham
that.
was suggesting in your interview, that the first big fight that divides Republicans in Congress and in the Senate from the White House is going to be whether to toughen sanctions on Russia, or even a debate over if the new president moves to ease sanctions against Russia.
Jeffrey, what do you? Lindsey Graham seemed to think he's got a lot of Republicans on board with him on the Russia sanctions. Do you think that's right?
Look, what the one thing about Donald Trump that a lot of Republicans in the Senate simply don't understand, is his affection, or however you want to call it, for the Kremlin. Right? I mean, until today, I mean, one of the sort of hallmarks of being a Republican is doubting Russia's intentions, whether it's a czar or a communist leader or the current plutocrat, the current autocrat who's in charge. So I think he's putting a lot of Republicans in a very unpleasant situation, because they are, every cell in their body says we have to doubt Putin and combat him. And he might very well come in and say, no, we're resetting this to the point where we're going to reduce sanctions. And there are a lot of Republicans who want to put sanctions on.
Let me step back. We're going to go back to foreign policy and these domestic issues in a second. But Frank, let me ask you about the speech itself. Why bother? People are saying there wasn't an outreach and there wasn't can you run a presidency with just the people who brung you, which looks like what he's thinking about doing?
For the short term, yes. But when the battles start, and you have to get 60 votes in the Senate, then there is no way to run an explicitly and strictly Republican effort. And I'm focused now on health care, because that's the #1 issue for a lot of Americans. And there is no way that you can repeal it with 51 votes, but you can't replace it under 60.
Yeah. Susan, you mentioned before the speech that Richard Nixon was a template, perhaps, for President Trump. And I went back and looked at that. There was a dark part of that speech, but he started it with a lot of light. And just one line from it: we cannot learn from one another until we stop shouting at one another, until we speak quietly enough so that our words can be heard as well as our voices. That's the piece that was missing from Donald Trump.
That's right. And previous presidents in their inaugural addresses have said things are bad. Ronald Reagan said things were bad. You know, presidents have taken over at times of greater national crisis than we face now, but they haven't been quite so unrelenting about it. I was surprised he didn't begin by acknowledging what President Obama has achieved as president. He thanked him for the transition effort, but he didn't say, for instance, you took over at a time of financial crisis and steered us through it. He didn't acknowledge the presence on stage of the Democrat. He defeated Hillary Clinton. He acknowledged her later at the congressional.
Who in an act of unity came.
Yeah.
Right.
So he didn't. It's not only that he was dark. That's happened before. It's that he didn't seem gracious to his foes. He didn't reach out to the people who did not vote for him.
But I think that's part of the psychology, though, of what the administration is trying to do. Because for people who supported Donald Trump, you cannot be against Barack Obama enough. And for him to have done more, for him to have acknowledged more, I think would have put him in a very difficult position with his supporters. It was the case that was a speech for his supporters, but also a speech for people who didn't support him as well, to say, look, if you expected me to change, that's not going to happen.
What about this, Frank? Here's a theory. Shoot it down quickly, if you will. This was a speech to his supporters, and he's locked in tight with them. with the full well knowledge of knowing that Washington's going to eat away at things. But in this big public moment, he wants to show, I am with you, that is what is in my heart, and all the things you may hear down the line about him capitulating or trimming his sails on a thing here and there to get legislation through, that won't be remembered. What will be remembered is he stood up there in that moment and spoke loud and proud about the things they love about him.
And he did. But that's not how you govern the country. You're not president of 46% of America. You're president of 100%. And in the green room before we came on, we were talking about our expectations for the future. I'm clearly the darkest person on this panel because I think we're going to remember this weekend for a long time to come as not the end, not the campaign being over, but this is the beginning of the most tempestuous, if that's the right word, the most, in my mind, awful conflict between left and right, between men and women, between young and old. I think we are breaking apart since 1968 when we lost some incredibly good people in this country. That's 50 years. I saw those signs in the parade, and they were so horrific. And there are 8, 9, 10-year-olds who are being taught to hate the other side. And that's the problem. When you teach young people to hate, you can't get it out of their system.
You know, John, you brought up Richard Nixon, and I was thinking, you're contrasting Nixon and Trump. Nixon didn't live in the social media age, and imagine Richard Nixon, by the way, with a Twitter account. That would have been something. Yeah. But I think to add on to what Frank's saying, I don't know if the climate, I don't know if technology is allowing people to see past their own hatreds.
It's not. It's encouraging it.
All right, let's take a pause here. We're going to take a short break, and we'll be right back with more from our panel. And we're back with our panel. Susan, I want to ask you, if I'm a Republican and I heard Donald Trump say that the politicians had reaped the rewards of government while the people have borne the cost, and that the establishment protected itself but not the citizens of our country, and I'm on that stage, A, how seriously do I take that as a shot at me? And B, do I worry in this negotiation back and forth that he might turn his Twitter account against me, a Republican who needs the votes of his coalition?
You bet. I mean, I think not just Republicans should be nervous about that. Democrats as well. You know, we talked about these two rising populist movements. The fact is that statement is something that both of them would have agreed with, that the politics as usual is not working for us, we the citizens, and we want some change. Now, they want to go in very different directions, but they would agree that current politics, not working for them, let's change it.
Lanhee, what do you make of the executive action taken on the Affordable Care Act and the kind of way the dismantling is going forward?
I think potentially it's quite broad, or potentially it could be only symbolic. It really depends on what they decide to do with it. I think it'll be interesting to see if the Trump administration uses executive authority on Obamacare to take it apart in the same way the Obama administration used executive authority to implement the law, because that's really what it's going to be. If the Trump administration, for example, says, we're not going to enforce the individual mandate, well, that will be very, very significant in its impact on the individual marketplace, and that potentially could drive insurers out unless they're ready to come in behind with another executive action to stabilize the market. So it'll be interesting to see how they use it.
Right, use the measures that Barack Obama used to put it in place to undo it.
And the broad interpretation of the law.
Frank, let me ask you this question. You mentioned doubt. Nobody knows which way the wind is blowing. Talk about that doubt in terms of the public and changing the Affordable Care Act. There are the polls that show people want to see a replacement and not just a repeal. What are the political lines as Donald Trump and Republicans try and take apart the Affordable Care Act?
3 lines, actually. The Republicans want it repealed, and they don't care what comes next. I mean, yes, they do want something there, but the first thing is get rid of it, and get rid of it within the first 100 days. The independents want repeal and replace, so repeal and repair, basically, which is, and these words matter, and you're going to see people arguing over it, which is get rid of it, but as quickly as you can, put something in that continues the pre-existing conditions and the kids being on their parents' plan, and then change the mandate and the cost. And Democrats want to know that everyone is going to be protected, particularly the affordability of it. So make no mistake, if they can show, if Republicans can show that the cost of health care will come down for most Americans, they will be acting in the way that the American people want. That's what they have to prove.
Tough thing to prove.
They have to. They don't have a choice.
Jeffrey, yesterday, President Trump made a visit to the CIA to thank and give his support. And what did you make of the visit?
I thought it was bizarre and inappropriate and somewhat dangerous. Bizarre because he was having what was essentially a campaign rally, a campaign-style rally or discourse, right by the CIA's Wall of Honor, Memorial Wall, which is akin for the intelligence community to the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. for the armed forces. So it was just that was a very strange thing and inappropriate thing to do. On substance, what was disturbing was he was criticizing or condemning the free press of the United States in front of a group of intelligence officers, in front of the CIA. That is something that is, sorry to use the word again, but somewhat unprecedented. And it reminded me, someone who's covered the Middle East, it reminded me of a discourse that you hear in places like Turkey or sometimes in Egypt, where the strong man is trying to undermine the institutions of civil society, the institutions of democracy. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't criticize the press, but in front of government employees, and not only government employees, but intelligence service employees, that struck me as a dangerous precedent.
But do they treat him, honestly, do they treat him fairly?
Does the press treat him fairly?
Yes, does the press treat Donald Trump fairly?
There's no one press. I think the so-called mainstream press holds him accountable for his statements and fact checks him. And often, as we saw yesterday with Sean Spicer, they don't like being fact checked, especially when they have their facts wrong and the press has their facts correct.
Susan, what did you make of Sean Spicer coming to the podium? There were a lot, as I pointed out, there was this executive action on the Affordable Care Act. There was real news to talk about, but he instead got into a fight with the press about the crowd size and the way it was reported.
I think this is, we've talked about some of the tests for President Trump going forward. There's some tests here for the press as well in coverage of the new president, because we have a role in accountability and providing context, in fact-checking, and you saw kind of some of the dangers ahead with Sean Spicer attacking the press for accurately reporting on an issue of crowd size. Talk about something we shouldn't be concerned about is the size of the crowds on the mall. But saying basically you can't believe the press, you can't believe the photos that the press show that demonstrate that the crowds were smaller than they were for President Obama's first inauguration. So I thought I think there are some challenges here for the press, and I thought it was a tough start for the press secretary to come out, say accurate reporting was untrue, and then leave without taking questions.
Lanhee, let me ask you about overseas and the inaugural address and what Lindsey Graham was talking about. There seems, again, to Frank's point, doubt, uncertainty about whether the Reagan vision of promoting freedom as a good that is in America's national security interest is still part of American policy under Donald Trump. What do you think?
Well, the inaugural address laid out a very different framework for foreign policy. I mean, America First has meaning for people that goes back many, many years, and it does suggest a very different orientation. Now, for the rest of the world, I think there's a little bit of, they're trying to figure out what's going on as much as we are as Americans. But I think for them, the implications are far more significant. If you go to Korea, or you go to Japan, or you go to Israel, or you go to the United Kingdom, or any of our Western European allies, or our allies in the rest of the world, there are questions about where America is going to stand. And I think the inaugural address really kind of put people on notice that this is going to be a different framework we're operating in. So I absolutely think we're in a different time, in a different place.
We have treaty relationships with some of the countries you just talked about, which suggest that America is not first in Washington's view, that Washington, post-World War II, when we became the global leader, that we decided that the defense of other countries was also worth our time, money, and even blood. And so this is the revolutionary aspect of what Donald Trump was saying, calling into question whether we're going to rise to the defense of free peoples.
I was also struck, Frank, that the president talked about how America had disappeared over the horizon against other countries. And there has been a long debate about American exceptionalism and whether presidents are sufficiently exceptional in praising America. That seems like and you wouldn't put that in the American exceptionalism hymn that we're disappearing over the horizon.
No, I really think the country's in trouble. If we don't trust the people who give us our news, if we get our news to affirm us rather than to inform us, then we're not going to collect any information. If we don't listen to others and allow our opinions to change over time, then the democracy weakens. And if our electoral process, if we're telling lies to the people in an effort to get elected, and we don't hear the accountability, then where are we headed from here, both nationally and internationally? We are losing the respect of the global community. We have lost the respect of Americans here. There's a sense that our democratic system and the institutions have failed us. And I see nothing in the last 48 hours to indicate that any of this is going to be addressed in the coming weeks or months.
Susan, Senator Graham, I've given him a job elevation there. Senator Graham, seems to be pushing forward on this Russia sanctions bill, which sets up a foreign policy, not just debate, but real things. What do you think will happen? Mitch McConnell's got to put a bill in front of the president doesn't seem to like.
Well, we don't know that will happen. Senator Graham said if the vote were tomorrow, he'd get 75 votes in the Senate, because the vote's not tomorrow, and the president, Trump, has some ability to lobby Republicans in the Senate as well. But I do think this could be an early flashpoint between the Congress, especially in the Senate, and the new White House, because there is a consensus, there is a Republican consensus among Republicans and Democrats in the Senate that Russia is not our friend, that Vladimir Putin is not a model that we should be following. So this could emerge as something kind of defining in the relationship, especially on foreign policy, between the president and the White House, between the White House and the Congress.
And Jeffrey, what do you make of Mr. Tillerson, Rex Tillerson, and his possible nomination to, being confirmed as Secretary of State?
Well, it seems more likely now that Senator Graham told you that he was going to vote for her. That's one thing.
And McCain says he will as well.
And McCain says he will as well. Rex Tillerson is in that category that people, at least insiders, believe is one of the grown-ups who's going to play a responsible role, along with Jim Mattis, in making sure that the United States fulfills its commitments overseas. There are obvious questions about putting the head of Exxon in as the head of the State Department, but he seems to have emerged as one of the more credible figures to be nominated by Donald Trump so far.
All right, we're going to have to end it there. Of course, Senator Marco Rubio, his vote is still outstanding. That'll be a real question since he's on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Thanks to all of you for being here. Thanks to all of you for watching, and we'll be back in a moment.